and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to be back here to introduce to you a brand new session of Words Are Bridges, a new initiative and series by the Jaipur Literature Festival in partnership with HarperCollins India. Words Are Bridges celebrates the power and magic of language, the way it brings us together across cultures and communities and countries. And of course, when we talk about language connecting across borders, we talk about translation and the power of translation.
Words are bridges.
शब्द सेतु है.
अल्फाज दिलों को और इंसानियत को जोड़ने का एक अजीम और तरीन पुल है.
വാക്കുകൾ പാലങ്ങളാണ്.
शब्द ही पुल है.
ഗുംസിരദലോ
शब्दों सेतु छे.
लफ्ज़ सरी को दिलदारान.
वहीनतुन.
आखर हमार मेल संग. आखर हमार जोड़.
तीन किपिनपुर चिंकेन.
শব্দই সমন্বয়ৰ হেতু.
কথাই হয়ো সেতু.
शब्द ही सेतु है.
কথাই ৰ याखराइस.
उतरा संको आसा.
तुही इनको गैनस्याम तू अनि.
வார்த்தைகள் பாலங்கள் போன்றவை.
अशरहना आपाती किसले.
साप्ताहिक माध्यम.
ग्राउथाइनिंग याउक्राई.
नंगड़ा तक्किल सेतुए कटोना.
शब्द सेतु होन.
शब्दां दी सांस.
Words Are Bridges will celebrate language and literature in translation. In the first season, we will be talking to eminent speakers writing across Indian languages and hope to share with you the joy and pleasure that comes from great literature and great conversation. But before we begin, I'd like to invite Namita Gokhale, Sanjoy K. Roy, and my colleague Udyan Mitra from HarperCollins India to welcome all of you.
Dear lovers of books and literature, words travel, ideas travel, stories travel. We welcome you to our new digital platform, Words Are Bridges. This important initiative looks at the act of translation as a mediation between languages and culture, between time and place. India's unique literary landscape, with its rich diversity and its absolutely staggering multilinguality, will be explored through a fascinating series of sessions that bring together writers, translators, and commentators. We at JLF are delighted to partner with HarperCollins India to expand our horizons of reading as we listen in to the original text and also examine its resonance through translations. Thank you.
Stories provide us place, context, culture, and tradition. In India, with our vast diversity of linguistic traditions, we often don't have access to each other's content. The Jaipur Literature Festival brings to you Words Are Bridges to explore translation and writing from across India in association with HarperCollins.
At HarperCollins, we've always watched with delight as words build bridges, as the books that we publish introduce readers to worlds often unknown to them. This is especially true of our translations, which wonderfully connect cultures through the written word. Today, unfortunately, readers and writers are feeling more isolated than ever before. JLF's Words Are Bridges is a lovely initiative to connect us all over again. We at HarperCollins are really excited to be part of this program.
Thank you, everyone. Our session today on Words Are Bridges is Nanak Singh's Khooni Vaisakhi, Navdeep Suri in conversation with Sanjoy Roy with a musical rendition of the poetry by Harpreet. On 13th April 1919, 22-year-old Nanak Singh joined the mass of peaceful protesters agitating against the Rowlatt Act at Jallianwala Bagh. It was a life-changing experience for him. He survived the massacre unnoticed amongst the hundreds of corpses, and his poem about the traumatic event, Khooni Vaisakhi, was banned soon after its publication in May 1920. Navdeep Suri has served as India's ambassador to UAE. After acclaimed translations of his grandfather Nanak Singh's novels, Pavitra Paapi as the Watchmaker and Khidya Phul as A Life Incomplete, he has worked on Khooni Vaisakhi, a long poem written by Nanak Singh in 1920 after surviving the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Sanjoy Roy, an entrepreneur of the arts, is managing director of Teamwork Arts, which produces over 25 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts, and literary festivals across 40 cities, including the world's largest literary gathering, the annual Jaipur Literature Festival. Sanjoy works closely with various industry bodies on important policies within the cultural space in India and abroad. Harpreet is a versatile artist who sings original musical compositions in Hindi as well as in Punjabi, Bengali, Assamese, Rajasthani, and Haryanvi. Trained in Hindustani classical music, he plays both the guitar and the flute. His original composition, Kutte, a song about a canine's view of human life, was selected by Bollywood's film director Dibakar Banerjee and Kanu Bail for the film Titli. Some of his yet-to-be-released compositions, Geet aur Shabd, Kho Gaye Hain Wo, and Sona Pani, have received wide appreciation. Please do comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section. Do follow our handles, JLF Litfest, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified of the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, don't worry. You can find us again on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Ladies and gentlemen, Khooni Vaisakhi.
कलगी वालड़े शहनशाह पिता मेरे चरणा तेरियां ते नमस्कार सतगुर करके मेहर इस डुबदी जांदी नूं धक्का मार के लाना पार सतगुर दास्तान शहीदा दी लिखने नूं दास्तान शहीदा दी लिखने नूं दास आपदा होया त्यार सतगुर तोड़ चाड़ना अपनी मेहर करके नानक सिंह ये करे पुकार सतगुर
So the poem English, O Father mine with the turban plumed, I bow at thy feet, my divine Guru. And it goes on to say, to pen a portrait of those departed ones, grant me the strength, my divine Guru, to remind my people across India, lest we forget their sacrifice, my divine Guru. To write the saga of our heroes such, your disciple is ready, my divine Guru. Do help me complete this mission of mine. Nanak Singh beseeches, O my divine Guru.
Really, I think, set in context for all of us what language is and what language means. Ambassador Suri, let me start with you. As it happens, coincidentally, you are in Amritsar, and I'm assuming that the portrait next to you is that of your grandfather, who you address as Bauji.
That's right. We are in the city where he spent the bulk of his years and wrote many of his masterpieces.
I remember you once telling me how, as kids, when you were growing up, you used to sit on the cot with Bauji in your ancestral home and just listen to the many stories that he used to tell you all in Punjabi.
Yeah, I mean, and that is when we were growing up. Remember, I was just 12 when he passed away in 1971. But growing up as kids, we would spend our summers in Preetnagar, which is a small village about 16 miles from Amritsar. And there, in the evenings, all the kids, the extended family, even the neighbors' kids would get together and every evening they'd clamor to Babuji to tell us a story. And he'd spin a yarn. He'd make something up, and he would have music and pathos and some jokes and everything. And our evening entertainment was taken care of by Punjabi language's greatest storyteller. Because I think it's important to remember that while this conversation is about Khooni Vaisakhi, but really, Babuji was best known as Nanak Singh, the novelist. And during the course of his lifetime, he wrote some 38 major novels, many of which are rightly regarded as classics of Punjabi literature and are almost mandatory reading in Punjabi, much the way that Thomas Hardy or Charles Dickens would be if you were reading English literature.
And Navdeep, Preetnagar itself was like an artist commune?
It was quite an interesting experiment that started somewhere in the late 20s, early 30s, where Sardar Gurbaksh Singh, an eminent writer in Punjabi himself, and one with a very communist ideology, which was quite fashionable at that time, started a commune where people could live in harmony, and he managed to attract quite a large group of writers, including some Bollywood personalities. I think Balraj Sani, of course, bought a house over there. Achla Sachdev got a house over there. Kabir Bedi's sister got one over there, and it became this community of intellectuals where there was a common kitchen and there was a real sense of contributing to the community.
Harpreet, I'm assuming you're hoping that there is such a commune in Bombay that you can, in fact, lock yourself away from COVID, etc. But Harpreet,
I know.
you're such an incredible musician coming, in many ways, from an independent genre of music where you've mixed many different forms, many different traditions, and many different languages. How did you come by Khooni Vaisakhi itself, and what is it that inspired you to be actually able to put song to the words that Nanak Singh had written so many years ago, over 100 years ago to be precise?
So the thing is, I grew up, listening to the stories about Jallianwala Bagh. From as I'm a Punjabi, I belong to a Sikh family, so it was there. वो अंदर का ही था हमेशा से कुछ मैं शब्दों में समझ नहीं आ रही कि उस चीज को कैसे बताऊं, but when I got to know about this poem and about Nanak Singh ji and and the fact that this poem is written by a survivor of Jallianwala Bagh massacre, so that thing was the initial inspiration. But when I sat down and started reading the poem, and it was so inspiring in a way. It was so relatable because I already had that thing in me, through the stories I've been listening since my childhood. So it got me the first initial inspiration to compose.
Navdeep, I remember when Harpreet first sent you and Mani the recording, you said that both of you had tears in your eyes because it was so evocative. But tell me, what is it about the Punjabi language or the nuance within the way Punjabi is spoken that's become such a popular idiom across the world, not just in India, because every Bollywood movie would necessarily have a Punjabi song, and that's the idiom of communication today. Is it the bowl, or is it the way that the words are strung together? What do you ascribe this to be? Especially when we're talking about words are bridges, it has been a bridge across communities and across countries because Americans and Canadians are also responding to Punjabi beats.
True.
Sanjay, I don't think all of that is necessarily positive. I think, it sometimes comes as a shock that I'm driving on some little road to Mangalore, and in the middle I see a wedding procession and they are dancing away to Bhangra beats. And I said, you have such a rich culture of your own. Why bring this element? So I don't want to be too parochial about it. But is it the earthiness of the language? Is it the simplicity or that comes from the fact that it's a largely agricultural community, very much rooted in the land? Sometimes you hear jokes which are, have kind of become parables of Santa Singh, Banta Singh. And again, there's that earthy simplicity about them.
But isn't it also the mithas, Navdeep? Because in most of the songs that you hear, it is that beauty of or the sweetness of words.
Exactly. I think it would be the sound of it, the phonetics in the language, and it sounds so musical. And as Ambassador Suri said, it's very relatable and you connect very easily. And of course, a huge credit goes to the kind of music Punjabi industry has been making. So it crosses the borders seamlessly.
Yeah, but Sanjay, I think particularly when we're talking to Khooni Vaisakhi, we shouldn't take any credit away from the genius of our young musician. I think the emotion that Harpreet has put into it really gave it a soul of its own, and so I just want to acknowledge that it is really, really superb. You were reminding me. So in true 21st century style, Harpreet sends me on WhatsApp his first shot at composing the music, which was the invocation that you heard. And I was driving, I was on my way back from Dubai to Abu Dhabi, and I couldn't wait to get home and be in a quiet space so that I could listen. So my first experience of the music of Harpreet was really on a mobile phone, sitting in Abu Dhabi. And as you said, Mani and I, my wife and I heard it, and both of us had tears in our eyes because it was just so profoundly moving.
Now, going back to the origins of Khooni Vaisakhi, you yourself didn't come to the work of your grandfather till much later. Your first work that you looked at translating was Pavitra Paapi. That was pretty much down your career. I think you were in London at that point of time. I'm going to start with that incident in Boulder, Colorado, where a congressman and also Ambassador Blackwell, after having heard Ambassador Navdeep Sarna and Vikas Swarup speak, turned to me and said, "What is it with Indian diplomats that all of them are so erudite and all of them write? So what brought you to writing and what brought you to the discovery of Bauji or Nanak Singh's work?"
I think in my case, you'd have to attribute it more to genetics than to diplomacy or the career choices. I really think that the fact that we are inheritors of such an enormous legacy. And my mother, growing up, would always be talking about my grandfather's writings. She was a teacher of Punjabi language at college as a lecturer. And she'd say, look at the genius of this man. Had he written in any other language, perhaps a more prevalent language, he could have been a person of international renown. And so at various points, she would keep nudging me that, look, you're the only one in the family whose English is halfway decent. So why don't you take a shot? Treat it as a sense of family responsibility to take that legacy further. And somewhere around 2001, 2002, I finally gave in to her persistence and took a shot at translating Pavitra Paapi, which was quite an iconic novel set in the Punjab of the 1920s and 30s, and also made into a celebrated film back in 1968. So that was my first effort. I was a very hesitant translator. I was a very careful translator, not wishing to take any liberties. And I knew that coming from a family where there are many cousins who are going to be looking very carefully at what I have done, there was an extra burden of writing, not just for the larger audience, but for the sort of literati within the family and make sure that it passed their test.
In fact, Khooni, when you got to Khooni Vaisakhi, the story, the discovery of Khooni Vaisakhi itself is a whodunit story. You want to just tell us how it was rediscovered? Because Nanak Singh wrote it, it then disappeared, it was banned by the British, it then reappeared. Tell us the story, because that's like fascinating.
Well, Bauji wrote this in early 1920, and it was first published in May 1920. And at that time, the Rowlatt Act was still in force. So clearly, it caught the eye of the British authorities, and it was banned, and all copies pretty much were confiscated. And for the next 60 years, from 1920 to 1980, all we knew within the family was that Bauji had written this poem. There's a passing reference to it in his own autobiography, Meri Dunya, which was published way back in 1949. And nobody had seen this. But my father, who is a publisher and who had published many of my grandfather's titles, was after this poem, and he kept looking for it. And at some point, he particularly when he met Gyani Zail Singh, then the chief minister of Punjab at the funeral for my grandfather, he pursued it with Gyani Zail Singh that, look, you are in a position of authority, and maybe from some archives you can help us find the book. And there was that process underway. But really, the interesting thing was in 1980, my father came across an article in a Punjabi literary magazine called Drishti, where he saw a longish piece about Nanak Singh as a poet, written by an academic from a college in Amritsar. And he said, how is this man, one Dr. Kishan Singh Gupta, able to make such detailed references to Khooni Vaisakhi in this article? And as my father tells it, he got gooseflesh when he read it, and he found the number of the editor of the Drishti magazine and said, who is this Kishan Singh Gupta who has written this article? I need to speak with him. Got his address. He and my mom got on their scooter and went across to this little house in the walled city of Amritsar, unannounced, met him, introduced themselves, and said, look, we've read your article, and tell us how you know so much about Khooni Vaisakhi. And then the scene sort of moves to Dr. Gupta, who said, look, my grandfather was quite a bibliophile, and he used to live in this small town. And from when we sold that old house at some point of time, his books and pamphlets and brochures and everything was put in gunny bags in sacks and brought to the basement of our house. And so I was sort of sifting through those sacks of books and publications, and I came across Khooni Vaisakhi. And since I am a teacher of Punjabi language, I immediately saw the significance of this pamphlet that I was holding in my hand, that this is something that had never been published before. And so he started writing about Nanak Singh as the poet. And from there on, the journey started. And my father republished Khooni Vaisakhi in 1980 with a long foreword and glossary prepared by Professor Gupta.
Wow. And fast forward, British Library, you're wanting a copy of the cover, of the original cover?
Well, I was kind of not satisfied, because when I started pursuing the translation of Khooni Vaisakhi last year, I kind of, there were a couple of passages where I wasn't sure about the sequencing of the passages, and I wasn't sure. I had still not seen an original version myself. And so I went back to Dr. Gupta and said, look, you're the guy who first wrote about it in 1980. And do you still have that copy? Can I take a look at it? And he said, look, I'm now in my 80s and I'm not keeping good health. And I've moved house also, and I'm now living with my sons, and I don't know where that is. So please don't, force me to look for it now. It is 30 years ago that, or 40 years ago that we worked on it, and I've forgotten about it. I said, all right. And then when we were with you coincidentally at the Jaipur Literature Festival, JLF in London, and you introduced me to the librarian of the British Library, I wanted to take that chance. I said, I'm sure they would have retained a copy somewhere in the depths of their archives. And sure enough, 2 days after I made the request to them, they came back saying, yeah, we've got a copy in our Yorkshire storage, but it'll take us a while to get it from there. And then they came back saying that, look, we've located a copy, but it's in such a fragile condition that we would need to first work on its conservation before it can even be photocopied. And that process again took several weeks, but eventually, after a fair bit of persistence, I have to say that I managed to get hold of a facsimile of the original. And we found all sorts of interesting things that till last year, we were not aware. We didn't know that at that time, my grandfather, while trying to market the books, was also trying to market some musical instruments and some religious objects and so on as an effort to make a living. So we discovered stuff about my grandfather in 2019 by virtue of having received that copy of the original.
Wow. I'm going to ask you, Navdeep, at this point to actually read from the book, the sequence we talked about, and then come back and talk about the poetry of it.
आखिर रोंवदे पिटदे मुड़े घर नूं सारे लोक होके परेशान यारो मुर्दे चुक के अपने मोडियां ते सारे शहर दे विच पहुंचाण यारो राती हाल बाजार मसीत अंदर सारे मुर्दियां ताईं टिकाण यारो सुबह चुक के तरफ सुल्तानविंड दी कब्रिस्तान दे विच पहुंचाण यारो लखां आदमी नाल जनानियां दे तुरे जावदे होए हैरान यारो सारे हिंदुआं सिखां ते मोमणां नूं डाडा लगा है गजब दा बाण यारो इक्को जिस्म इक्को दर्द इक्को सारे मजहब इक्को होए जान यारो एक होर अश्चरज दी गल देखी जेडी कदी है बहुत हैरान यारो हिंदू सिख उदों या हुसैन कहंदे मुसलमान कहंदे राम राम यारो आखिर जाए पहुंचे कब्रिस्तान अंदर सारे सिख हिंदू मुसलमान यारो एक जगह ते फूकिया हिंदुआं नूं दूजी जगह मोमन दफनान यारो बाकी जख्मियां सहदे लुचदियां नूं पास डॉक्टर तुरंत पहुंचाण यारो नानक सिंह अगाह नूं किवें होई सुनो अगली दी दास्तान यारो. And the English translation: they straggled, drenched in anger and tears, distraught they truly were, my friends, carried corpses on their shoulders bent, limped back to their city sad, my friends. Al-Bazar's mosque was the night's abode for bodies placed in rows, my friends, heaved up next morning and off again to Sultanwind's graveyard large, my friends. Funeral processions, joined by thousands more, walked angrily, dazed and distraught, my friends. Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim strode side by side, hearts pierced by arrows sharp, my friends. Each bound by the same grief and pain they shared, each bound by sorrow same, my friends. Then a sight most wondrous was seen. It left us amazed and awed, my friends. Ya Hussain, cried out the Hindus and Sikhs, as Muslims echoed Ram Ram, my friends. And thus they reached the graveyard together, Hindu, Muslim, and also the Sikh, my friends. Funeral pyres flamed for Hindus and Sikhs, with Muslims buried alongside, my friends. Others injured, wounded, and limping slow were taken to doctors from there, my friends. Asks Nanak Singh what happened next. Stay on and listen with me, my friends.
Thank you, Navdeep. 120 or so years later, thank you for bringing this alive. I think for the world to be able to read and hear, and especially in the context today. Going back to the actual effort of translation, I mean, your grandfather wrote this more as a dirge with different chapters that gave the setting, the pre-setting to the incident itself, and then what happened post. When you were translating it, I remember we were traveling in a car with Javed Akhtarji, and you asked Javed ji a question. You want to just tell us about that process that was working in your head and why you were conflicted in the way that you were translating it?
Well, let me say that, I was a very nervous translator. I had never translated verse. I didn't think I had much of a penchant for it. I'd never seriously delved into poetry. Much of my reading had been fiction and non-fiction. And so when I said about this, the conflict was, should you sacrifice the rhyme and rhythm of the poem and get the substance accurately together, which means should you resort to free verse? And in doing so, or at least in considering that at an early stage, I had in mind our senior colleague, Ambassador Pavan Verma's translations of Gulzar Saab's poetry. And much of that has been done in free verse. And we've heard those several times at the Jaipur Literature Festival. So I had that kind of in my mind, that can I take that liberty with the verse? Then I started reading up more about it. And for me, actually, a defining point was, there's this marvelous book written by an American polyglot, Douglas Hofstadter. It's called In Praise of the Music of Language. In one chapter in the book, he's of course, the book is about translation and poetry and so on. But at one point, he takes Alexander Pushkin's masterly novel, which was entirely written in verse, Eugene Onegin, and gives example in a kind of a quadrant of 4 different translators who have worked on Eugene at different points of time. And he asks the reader, here's the original in Russian, here's one translation, 2, 3, 4. Which one do you like most? And he's kind of drawing the reader in. But the remarkable thing was, all 4 of them had translated that in a manner that stayed true to the verse. And there is that whole thing that there is a sanctity perhaps in preserving the original intonations or the rhythm of the language. And that's eventually what I ended up doing.
You stuck to the meter in your translation of this?
I stuck to the meter. It meant sometimes being a little ingenuous. It meant sometimes contriving a particular way to end. In the passage that I had read,
Your friends, my friend.
Every second and fourth line ends with Yaro, and so it's my friend. But then I kind of extended that in a couple of other places because you simply wouldn't get enough words that would capture the rhyme. And I saw that my grandfather at the age of 22 had also been quite clever in the way he adapted. So I kind of tried to borrow from that and sometimes even extend it beyond what he had done, simply so that I could stay true. Because again, there's this thing that poetry is meant to be read aloud, and so it should have that element preserved.
Now, the other challenge I'm assuming that you've had, and this is certainly across languages, because in the Indian idiom or in the Indian languages, nuance is such an important aspect. I mean, Naka, for example, in Bengali, and the Nakre Wali, for example, doesn't quite translate into English. In your translation of the dirge that your grandfather did you have to struggle to be able to find adequate expression in the English vocabulary to be able to say what Nanak Singh was trying to do?
I did, and there were times where I felt completely inadequate to the task because when you are trying to describe a scene of women kind of beating their chests when they discover that their sons have died in the massacre in Jallianwala Bagh, when they come across the body of a loved one, wailing isn't good enough. And you also don't want to be too literal in terms of describing. And remember, if you're trying to retain the rhythm of the poem, you've only got 7 or 8 words to play around with. So in those 7 or 8 words that will constitute a line, and the 2 lines that will constitute the couplet that is in the poem, you are trying to do a meter, and you're trying to make sure the second and fourth lines rhyme, and you are trying to find words which are adequate for conveying the emotion that was there. So I think what you end up doing then is placing yourself under a lot of different constraints. And so you recognize that there are constraints, there are borders that you've drawn around. And so you kind of look at what is the best possible fit that you can do under the circumstances.
Navdeep, when I read the copy that you had sent me before it went for publishing, one of the emotions that I had was that, of course, it gave you, certainly it gave me for the first time the perspective of what led to the Jallianwala Bagh incident, what happened in the incident, and what happened post the incident, and Bauji's, Nanak Singh's prayers. But in all of that, in the language that he used and the fact that he was part of the incident, he was at Jallianwala Bagh, he fell underneath two bodies of his friends, he passed out. What I didn't see at all was this uncontrolled rage that sometimes you see on television today. What instead I saw was a huge considered nuance of trying to document and make sense of a situation which was really momentous. And I'm going to ask you actually to read from the General Dyer's sequence for that. But just leading up to that, two questions. One is political. You were ambassador, so I need to ask you a political question. And because you've served in the UK, should Britain apologize for the Jallianwala Bagh incident? That's question number one. And two, what is it that in Nanak Singh's experience, because he'd been through both partition and hopefully you're going to translate for the world some of his partition novels, and before that, the lead up, Jallianwala Bagh. What is it that made him so considered? He himself was unlettered, right? I mean, it's not that he had a degree, PhD in creative writing, or he went to any kind of institute. He was unlettered. So what is it in Nanak Singh that made him express himself in the way that he did, in your understanding of his work that you've translated?
So let me take the first one first. The demands for the British apology on Jallianwala Bagh have again resurfaced in the last week or so, particularly now that the Belgians have found some way of apologizing for their sins in Congo. But there was a really interesting discussion on this in my session at the Jaipur Lit Fest in London. One of the points that came up was the Brits have been responsible for so many egregious acts around the world during the period of colonization, of the imperial period. Which ones should they apologize for? Are the ones that happened in Kenya less significant?
Why
for
can't
example,
they apologize for it all? I mean, finally, it's karma, right? It's their suffering right now.
But the interesting thing that came up. So yes, I really think that the Brits would do well to apologize for it. But along with the apology, and certainly not a substitute, it should be a conscious effort to rewrite the curriculum that is of history that is taught in schools, so that even today you don't have a situation of, say, a young student going to school reading a very whitewashed version of imperial history. And what struck me was the conversations that I had with some young British Indians who've been born in UK, and who so related to this just on the grounds that, hey, this is completely new to us. So while Jallianwala Bagh is this huge moment in Indian history, you have kids growing up in UK who have been taught nothing about it in their schools. So I think that would be as important as an apology, that at least future generations are aware that the imperial history was not quite what it's made out to be.
Navdeep, I'm going to ask you to read that para before you actually answer my second question.
Sure.
So if you could go ahead and do that.
The martyr's certificate to Dyer. Shame on you, you merciless Dyer, what brought you to Punjab, O Dyer? Not a sign of mercy unleashing such horror. How badly were you drunk, O Dyer? You came here thirsting for our blood. Will a lake of it fill your greed, O Dyer? So many innocents mowed down by you. The Almighty will demand answers, O Dyer. You scoundrel who gave you the right to make mincemeat of our patriots, O Dyer, wreaking terror upon us innocent folk. Did you fancy the taste of power, O Dyer? Just as you riddled our bodies with bullets, you too will pay the price, O Dyer. You will die and head straight to hell. Such torment awaits you there, O Dyer. Coming face to face on that judgment day, what answers do you plan to give, O Dyer? You tyrant, until the end of time, you'll be called the murderer that you are, O Dyer. Our Lord will punish you for your crimes. Watch how you get destroyed, O Dyer, says Nanak Singh, which holy book allows for innocents to be butchered like this, O Dyer.
Beautiful. And would you take the question that I posed to you, and then I will ask Harpreet a closing question.
So, Bauji was at the age of just 22, and somebody who had very little formal education, he never went beyond 4th or 5th grade, saw this as a narrative where he's trying to tell you what happened in those tumultuous 14 days in the first fortnight of April. The run-up to the Rowlatt Act, the efforts to prevent the Rowlatt Act from being passed, the mood in the city of Amritsar as the protests started gathering storm, the massacre itself, and then the aftermath of the massacre and the tragedy. I think it's quite remarkable that the only hint of anger that you see in the poem is in this section about General Dyer. The rest of the poem really is quite dispassionate. It is graphic at places. It is evocative, but I don't think he has tried to insert his own self into it, except as a narrator who's almost dispassionately observing the events and telling the story to the society. I felt that the three key things that really came out of the poem. One is the tribute to martyrs. He saw this as a poem for posterity, and there are several references to that lest we forget, we must remember the sacrifices of those who died in Jallianwala Bagh. The second, of course, is the spirit of communal amity that prevailed in the city of Amritsar in 1919, less than 30 years before partition and its horrors. And the final thing I really look up to Bauji now even more is the raw courage of an individual who is condemning Dyer in these forms at a time when the Rowlatt Act was still in force. And so freedom fighters in their own right, people who like him were picking up the pen and taking it up. Coming back to contemporary times, I think, if you look at the sedition laws that we still have, they're not too different from the Rowlatt Act. And it's quite remarkable that, governments come and go, but nobody seems convinced about the need to bring some reforms in these sedition laws. And we have contemporary 21st century versions.
Governments only believe in power at that point of time. So let's not put too much of faith in governments. But Navdeep, going back to that anger, and this is a question also for you, Harpreet, that when you first read the poem, and the question that I asked to Navdeep, did you struggle because in your rendition you hear the pain and you hear and sense the situation as it is? So Harpreet, because you're a singer-songwriter, you write your own poetry as well. When you were discovering Nanak Singh's poetry in this form, what came to you, and how did that then translate into the fact that you set it to the music that you have?
I think it's the imagery the whole poetry creates, basically. It takes you to that time, and actually feel that you are there and you are in that moment, and that sort of brings that pain, which you hear in the composition. And it just happened. You, while composing, you are, completely a blank paper, and once you start working on a composition, then it depends a lot on the poetry, like what you are getting out of it. In fact, first time I really experienced the pain was when I sang it for the first time on stage. Like the real pain. I didn't know that it is going to be that emotional for me, that intense. It was more like a spiritual.
You had tears coming down your eyes.
Exactly.
And many people in the audience had tears.
So that was the first time ever, I could not control my tears on stage. And, right after my performance, I just had to keep my guitar at a safe place, and I had to just run out of the auditorium. It was a very strange experience for me, and just tears were just shedding. I was not really crying. I don't know what it was. It was, I would say it was a spiritual experience for me, and it was, I don't know. I can't explain it in words. It was like first experience of that sort.
But it was beautiful, and thank you so much, Harpreet, for putting it to music. Navdeep, thank you so much for translating this, bringing this alive. So many more questions to ask about Nanak Singh, his partner who was jailed, who was publishing some of the work that he had done, about his own story, your story, but perhaps we'll have to leave it for another point. Before I go, Navdeep, just so that our audience gets a sense, I mean, this is about Words Are Bridges. Are you going to be bringing alive any more of Nanak Singh's work, which is perhaps lost to the larger world because it's only in one language?
Two of his novels, very highly regarded in Punjab and somewhat controversial for the theme, were around partition. The first of these was written in February 1948, and my grandfather was present in Amritsar and watched firsthand the horrors of the partition, and started thinking aloud that, have we lost our humanity? Was this worth it? So I guess, as we start looking at celebrations of the 75 years of India's independence, it's worth going back 75 years and perhaps pull out two of his novels on the partition, which will provide perhaps a perspective of what Punjab and the city of Amritsar went through and the price that was paid.
Ambassador Suri, thank you so much. Harpreet, thank you. And we look forward to this last song that we are now going to hear. Thank you all for listening in, and thank you, Swati.
ठीक वक्त साढ़े 5 बजे दा सी लोग जमा हुए कई हजार प्यारे कहंदे जूना असां दा होया औखा किथे जाए के करिए पुकार प्यारे अज लफ्ज तदबीर मुंह विच हसी उधर फौज ने तूड़े तुम्हार दी थोड़ी देर पीछे फौज गुर खेदी जनरल डायर ने अगा वदा
that wonderful session, Navdeep and Sanjoy. And thank you for that beautiful rendition, Harpreet. And thank you, all of you, for being such a great audience. If you've loved the session, do share it with your friends and talk about it on your social media pages. And do send us your feedback. We value it highly. We look forward to seeing you in our session next week.